Thank you very much, Henning. I want to speak about the nature pathway to net zero and how building long-term, reliable carbon credit portfolios of nature-based solutions can help companies to get on this nature pathway towards net zero. And specifically, I would like to cover 3 questions. The first question is, why should companies invest into nature-based solutions at all? The second question is, when should they do that? And the third question is, how can they do that best? Our purpose at goodcarbon is to shift as much capital as possible into the restoration and the conservation of our precious ecosystems, the forest, the soil, and also the oceans. And I want to convince you today that this question is relevant, and to do so is also relevant. And the first reason why companies should get active into restoring nature through nature-based solutions is because we can't solve the climate crisis without solving also the nature crisis. And nature-based solutions is part of the solution. So if you look at the global deforestation today, it is the 3rd biggest emitter of CO2 after the US and China. And at the same time, and we have heard it from Stefan earlier, we are losing biodiversity at scale at the moment, which accelerates that process. At the same time, nature-based solutions, the restoration of our forest, the soil, and the ocean is a fantastic way of solving that problem. In 3 ways. Nature-based solutions can decarbonize the atmosphere at scale. So 10 billion tons of CO2 can be removed from the atmosphere or avoided to be emitted annually, which represents 20% of our homework of decarbonizing the atmosphere. So 20%. It's readily available and it's economically attractive. The second reason is that nature-based solutions do something very unique, which only nature can do, which is obviously restoring and also protecting biodiversity. And the third reason is that nature-based solutions come with a great impact also on local communities by providing a benefit to those. But nature-based solutions are not only needed on a global scale, and we have heard it from Stefan earlier, nature is a productivity factor. So different studies show that 50% of our GDP today is directly or indirectly dependent on nature and the resources which nature provides. So companies have an inherent interest to also protect within their value chains nature and natural resources. But there's also a third reason why companies should get active into nature-based solutions, which is coming back to this nature pathway towards net zero. More than 3,000 companies have made pledges to become net zero over the next decades, and you see many of those companies from the printing industry, the leaders of the printing industry among those. And what is becoming clearer and clearer, and Henning touched upon it, most of these companies will not achieve net zero without also removing any unavoidable emissions after they have done their homework of reducing first, right? But this is becoming more and more clear. And the good news is that companies who also use carbon removal and essentially offset any unavoidable emissions are also more effective in reducing. Why? Because most of those companies assign a price to their carbon emissions and thereby essentially give an economic incentive of teams to really reduce their emissions first. So 3 reasons why companies should get active into nature, because it can also help them on their net zero path. Now there's one problem. If you look at all the companies which have essentially made those net zero pledges, and if you look at how many carbon removal they require to achieve their net zero targets, and you only take the 10% rule of SBTi, which means only 10% of the unavoidable emissions or of the total emission space can be removed, then we will require 1.5 billion tons of removal in 2050. Now there's a problem because the offer, what the current issuance of carbon removal credits represents, is only 30 million in 2023. So essentially there is a demand outstrips supply at the moment by a factor of 50, and this is even true if you look at 2030. It's not outstripping by a factor of 50, but there is a scarcity of supply in that market. So carbon removal from nature-based solutions. And that has a profound impact also on another dimension, which makes it for companies visible in their P&L, that the price per ton for one carbon removal is going to increase over the next 30 years by a factor of 10 to 15 if you follow the different price studies which are out there. And even in the coming years until 2030, you see prices of $50 to $80 a ton. Today, 1 ton of carbon removal from nature-based costs around 20 to 30 euros, right? So you already have a factor of 3, which companies will see in that market. Well, you could argue, does it matter? A factor of 3 on a tiny cost base, it doesn't really matter. The problem is if you look at the heavy emitters in the industry, then this cost line will have a significant impact also on profitability in the order of 10 to 15% of EBITDA easily, right? So it matters to already secure prices today. And there's a third problem, that quality and access to high quality nature-based solutions is scarce. It's even scarcer than the overall offering. And we have seen in 2023, the past year, a tremendous, I would say, turmoil in the industry where a lot of the projects which have sold carbon credits to companies to compensate any unavoidable emissions have essentially been accused of, not selling, of selling essentially hot air, right? Because the projects did not hold what they have promised, and essentially companies have bought a liability and also a reputational risk into their operations. And you see companies like Delta, which have recently faced a lawsuit and a claim of up to $1 billion, right? And there are other companies also in Europe which have been affected. So the reputation element of identifying high quality nature-based solutions is one which matters drastically, because we obviously want to have an additionality element and make a real impact on the global atmosphere. But companies have the challenge to what does really good look like, and how do they identify that within the projects which get offered to them. Now, we offer and we propose a very simple playbook how companies and also companies in the printing industry can essentially use the nature pathway to net zero by building up nature-based solutions, carbon credits from nature-based solutions. And it's essentially following a very simple process which starts with defining science-based targets. Why science-based targets are important? Because it gives the scientific fundament of against greenwashing. Right? So essentially doing your homework first, which means reducing, and then leveraging a certain number of carbon credits to complement your net zero journey. And then it starts about defining and updating the requirements which you have, building up your portfolio, and then managing it over time. Now you will ask, what is so difficult about doing that? Well, I guess look at your personal wealth, right? You take your money which you earn, which is on your bank account, and you invest that money into the stock market. You would never invest money, I hope so, you would never invest your money without having reliable data of the stocks or bonds or whatever assets you're investing into, right? You want to know, are they making a profit? Are they making revenue? And what are also the predictions in the coming years? And the same is true in nature. And there are today still multi-million-dollar purchasing decisions done in the industry around nature-based solutions which are not based on proper data. right? And that leads to all sorts of consequences, obviously, for companies which are engaged. Now, the good news is that producing a digital twin of nature, which is fully data-based, based on true data, not only once, but over time, is possible and should be at the heart of what companies do. And this is what we call the nature analytics approach and nature analytics framework. And it should be at the core of anything you do as a company in that space. Why? Because nature, for many companies, is not part of their core business. Nevertheless, they depend on it. Think about water dependency in the printing industry. Now, what does it mean? It essentially means a digital twin of nature means that you can translate the impact, the risk mitigation, and also the integrity of the projects which have been implemented through data points. And we have developed a proprietary framework which consists of more than 150 data points, which essentially captures on the impact front this triple impact which I mentioned in the beginning: CO2 sequestration, biodiversity, equally important, and also the social impact. Climate change adaptation, we have heard about the rising sea levels, and the flood protection is also a consequence of climate change, which is taken into account. But really considering the impact of those projects beyond the CO2 sequestration effect is fundamentally important. On the risk mitigation and also on the integrity sides, it also covers obviously the long-term outlook and the long-term integrity of the partners which implement those projects, which are mostly in the global south, in Panama, in India, in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, but can also be in the global north. But you want to know who are your partners on the ground which are managing those assets over time. We argue to play with the rules of the market, which means there are standards out there like Vera, Plan Vivo, and others. All the projects which we bring onto our platform have been validated by these, but we go beyond and essentially provide the data base for that. We have essentially three sources of inventory. We have projects which are from the open marketplace, projects from third-party project developers. We also develop our own projects, which we call the goodcarbon originals. The biggest mangrove project in India is part of one of our originals. And the third one is that we also develop projects bespokely for companies which have specific requirements. So we use that framework, and I want to give you one example of how that looks in practice from the company which is called Melitta. Melitta is a 2 billion revenue coffee and producer of home appliances, company from Germany with a long history, 110 years old. So they have nature in their value chain, and obviously would like, with any, let's say, personalization of asset allocation which you do personally, Melitta has the same idea and saying, hey, what is essentially a project mix which corresponds to my environmental footprint? And what we have done is essentially we have personalized and we have customized the variables in the nature analytics framework to correspond to their footprint, to then be able to tailor a customized compensation portfolio against these requirements. Yeah, so it's essentially your personalized strategy to build up your nature pathway towards net zero. Well, you can then take that, and what we argue is that companies, given the price risk, given the volume risk, and also given the availability risk for high-quality nature-based solutions in the market, should not only react, like in the past, but they should essentially build up a portfolio proactively also for the future. Which means considering the need in carbon credits over the next decades, companies can already today secure from projects they're identifying which fit also their environmental footprint, the right assets, and engage obviously in contracts which allow them to secure prices, to lock in the prices, and also to lock in the quantities of those assets already today. And that's what we have done for many companies in the industry. Those companies are now in the position to almost lean back, right, and to avoid the yearly due diligence cycles of assessing projects. and they only rely on those projects, obviously, then delivering those assets in the future. Yeah, so really a portfolio building approach which is proactive towards the future, and we are putting in place risk mitigation mechanisms and also contracts. We'll speak more about that in at the end of the second quarter of this year, where we jointly with insurances in the industry give the ability to protect against non-delivery of future carbon credits. And one of those examples, the second case study, is an effort where we have jointly with or for one of the leading companies in Germany have built a forward-looking portfolio which allows this company to do exactly that, to lock in prices, to secure volume and availability, and to have access to a portfolio of carbon credits from projects which also fit to their requirements. And this is one of the biggest portfolio which we have built in Europe for that company of nature-based solutions. Once you obviously have built this portfolio, it allows companies then to also, with our solution, to understand how are those assets developing over time, right? So if you're expecting those credits in 1 year, in 2 years, or in 3 years' time, you want to know, are those projects really developing as planned and as anticipated. Yeah? So essentially managing your portfolio actively is then one ability. So we really argue for building up this asset management logic to your company-specific pathway towards net zero. Now, I want to summarize. We're doing this and we're very proud on this, for leading companies in Germany and in Europe, such as Deutsche Telekom, Bertelsmann, Klett, Redcare, and BCD Travel, for example, in the travel space. And what we deliver and what we allow those companies to do on their nature pathway towards net zero is to have a verified impact, not only on CO2 sequestration, but also on biodiversity. We have heard from Stefan how important it is today, and on social impact, to have a plannable net zero claim, right? And we have seen earlier how many companies already have made those claims without really knowing how to get there, right? So essentially anticipating the need which companies have over time, and then also having an amplified return on your investments by linking the investments you do to the reporting you have to give to stakeholders. And we have seen how many reporting standards there are out there, and how CSRD is, for example, gaining or putting also weight on companies' reporting requirements. So I leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. And if you want to get in contact, I leave you my email address on that page, jerome@goodcarbon.earth. We are 3 years old. We are Berlin-based, and we're very much looking forward to any conversations with you. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention.